This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. They're the best women's soccer team in the world, so why aren't they paid like the best men's team? The U.S. women's national team is in France as it competes in the 2019 FIFA World Cup. On Monday, the team made it to the quarterfinals after they beat Spain.
Game on the line. Rapinoe will strike. Rapinoe scores. 2-1 U.S.
Now, if the American women win the World Cup, the team will share $4 million, but that's $34 million less than the reigning men's World Cup champions, France. Today, Where We Live, we'll talk soccer and also find out why gender gaps persist in women's professional sports. We'll look into the rise of women's sports, from soccer to basketball to hockey, with Quinnipiac University professor Molly Yanity. First, you have soccer fever. Did you play the game, or did you look up to women like Mia Hamm and Abby Wambach? Join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, the next U.S. women's game is this Friday when it takes on another powerhouse, France. For more on the national team, joining us via Zoom is Alicia Delgado. She's editor and co-founder of Pro Soccer USA. She's covering the World Cup. She joins us from Paris. Alicia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with that game against Spain. Tell us about that game. Was it the first time the U.S. women were really tested in the tournament so far?
I think so. I mean, if you ask them, they've been tested the entire time. Certainly Sweden was expected to be their first test, but they handled that team pretty well. So I think this was definitely the first game that was kind of intense and back and forth, a lot of shift in momentum for them, and a little bit scary at times.
So tell us about the women that are on the national team. Let's start with Connecticut native Alyssa Nair, the goalkeeper. She's got pretty big shoes to fill. Many fans of Hope Solo out there can remember that she was a goalkeeper for many years. So tell us about Alyssa.
Yeah, Alyssa's a really quiet person. She prefers to stay behind the scenes. So a little bit more difficult to get to know her, which is a stark contrast to Hope Solo. But she's also faced a lot of criticism because she's following in Hope's footsteps. And Hope and Brianna Scurry have openly criticized her as well, so that hasn't helped. So when she made an error pretty early in the game last night, which led to the Spain goal, kind of made everybody shake their heads and think that, oh no, maybe they were right. But she kind of rebounded, and after the match, she and all her teammates and the coach said that she did a really great job rebounding, put it behind her, and they all trust her moving forward.
Another one to watch, especially from yesterday's game, was Megan Rapinoe. Do you think this will be her last World Cup?
Likely, yes. I think it's going to be the last World Cup for a couple of the veteran players, but you never know. You know, Brazil has a 41-year-old player playing in the World Cup, so there's always the chance.
And is that something that is becoming more common, where you have women professional players in their 30s, late 30s, still competing?
I don't know about more common. I think we've seen it over the years, but definitely with some of the countries that are still developing, I think some of their top players play a lot longer because maybe the development isn't quite there. The investment isn't quite there. So developing new players can be more difficult.
Let's talk about how other countries are developing their women's team. I had mentioned at the top of the show, U.S. women are ranked number 1 in the world. Spain, again, putting up a good game against the U.S. yesterday. When has their program really started to turn around?
Yeah, really just in the last few years, there's been more investment at the local club level that has led to this increased talent, increased technical ability, and just growth overall of the women's game there. So to see them rise so quickly, and other countries in Europe as well, they're really starting to close the gap between the United States and the rest of the world.
The U.S. is still a strong favorites to win. Tell us about some of the other teams that may be standing in their way, starting with France.
Yeah, so obviously France first. This is the biggest game. A lot of people wanted to see this game later, maybe in the final, but always was going to happen in this quarterfinal, and it is happening as expected. So there were some pretty colorful quotes from Rapinoe last night about how crazy she hopes this game will be and that it's a circus. and other colorful language that she used. But yeah, this will be a big game, big test, big crowd for them. And then moving forward, they could have England in their way as well, which won the She Believes Cup back in February. And on the other side of the bracket, there's Germany, along with some other countries that are performing well, like Norway and Italy and Japan, that could advance.
When we're later on in the show, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the rise of certain professional women's sports team. When you look at some of the countries that are participating in the World Cup this year, some of those countries at one time it was illegal for women to play soccer or football. Tell us a little bit about some teams like Chile, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of countries, and not just countries like Chile that are still developing. In England and France, women were banned from playing football. So all of these countries are really starting to now see increased investment in the women's game, and still not where it needs to be, and still fighting certainly for that. But Chile, I think, based on their performance against the United States in this tournament, I think 4 8 years from now, if they continue the growth and the investment that they're starting to see, could be a quality team.
Going beyond Europe, Thailand made news in the World Cup, especially the story behind the woman that is investing a lot in that team. Can you tell us about them, Alicia?
Yeah, so they just, they were really, really grateful to be making their second appearance in the World Cup, and knew that they would have a tough road, knew that they would probably be blown out by the United States and by most of the countries that they faced. And so there was a video making the rounds on social media. I'm not sure if you saw it, but their investor kind of crying hysterically and hugging the coach when the team scored a goal, even though it was in a game that they lost, just that they scored and was an emotional moment for them. So that's kind of what we see in these smaller countries that are now, starting to advance in the women's game. Just a lot of passion, a lot of fight, and knowing that there's a lot of work still to do.
This is Where We Live. Joining us via Zoom is Alicia DeGallo, editor and co-founder of Pro Soccer USA. She's covering the Women's World Cup from France. She's joining us from Paris today as we take a look at the U.S. women's national team, but also how other teams from different countries are developing, getting better. In studio with me is Molly Yanity, assistant professor of journalism at Quinnipiac, who was a former sports reporter. Molly, have you been watching the World Cup?
I haven't missed a game.
So tell us what you've noticed about this tournament.
One of the things that kind of listening to Alicia talking about the countries that are developing, you look at Thailand, who has a private benefactor. Jamaica, another one, Bob Marley's daughter, has privately funded the operation of Jamaica women's football. The coaches for Jamaica are all volunteer. This is a group that has barely practiced together, much less paid or played together. And we contrast that with the United States team, which travels all over the world for years at a time. But there's still an element of the private investment in U.S. women's soccer. For example, Luna Bar. I had never had a Luna Bar until they made this sponsorship with the U.S. But this is a company that makes what's the word? Protein bars. Yeah, thank you. And they have done a private sponsorship with U.S. Soccer to provide bonus money for the women because U.S. Soccer isn't stepping up to make this equal. We can look like, oh yeah, they'll get there someday. Even at the top, at number one in the world, the U.S. still isn't there.
Alicia, let's talk more about the fight for equal pay. A lot of attention on the World Cup now, but the U.S. women's national team players actually have a suit against the U.S. Soccer Federation. Tell us why they're suing.
Yeah, they're suing for what they are calling systemic gender-based discrimination when it comes to pay, and also inequality in treatment. So their playing surfaces, training surfaces, and travel conditions. So this has been ongoing for years that they've been fighting this, and the lawsuit is bringing more attention to it now. What they're looking for is is fair and equitable pay, not necessarily equal pay to the men, because there's a lot of different things that go into this. They have different collective bargaining agreements. They have different payment structures. So equal may not be the best word to use, but equitable and fair pay.
Well, when we're saying equitable and fair pay, so what would that amount actually be?
Well, that's the question that everybody's trying to figure out. We don't know what that amount would be. They're going to have to discuss that and argue that with U.S. Soccer and throughout this lawsuit. But we can definitely say it would be more than what they're making now. And some main things would be, charter flights for every trip like the men get, making sure that they don't play on artificial turf surfaces ever, which is also something that the men get and the women have been fighting for. So things like that are more easy to define and quantifiable than actual dollar figures.
When we're talking about pay, I'm also curious about oftentimes the corporations, people who sponsor pay attention to how many people are watching, but women have actually been setting viewership records. Is that something that can play a part in these types of negotiations, Alicia?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, broadcast rights and deals and the amount of money brought in from that is huge for any organization. So the more that they draw, the more people that watch them, the more beneficial it is for their negotiations.
Molly Yannity, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal just came out with a piece last week, which actually had the dollar signs of the fact that after the 2015 World Cup, in which U.S. women won, for the next 3 years, the U.S. women have actually outpaced the men's program in profitability. So 2016, 17, 18, the women brought in about $2 million more. And you look back at the early years of the 2000s, and that gap was very large. The men were bringing in close to $20 million, the women less than $5 million. But as that gap is closed, we were talking specifically about what is the figure we're looking at. It's really just a matter of who's contributing to that pot and what the percentages are out of it. So while the TV deals and the sponsorship are huge, the biggest chunk of that $20 to $5 million from the early 2000s was actually in Ticketgate. And that has flipped. I mean, not to that with that gap, but the women are drawing more, have more in arena, and as you noted, that television and sponsorship has really come up. So they're really looking at the percentage of the pie to get more than the exact figure.
And we should know.
We're actually here with Rachel Bachman from the Wall Street Journal, who wrote that story. She's here in this group with us. So we've talked at length about that story, and that, to clarify, is ticket sales and the events line. And there are other streams of revenue to consider that she didn't get into. But in terms of events and ticket sales, the women have outpaced the men the past 3 years.
And they actually are pretty. They're much better than the men's team when we look at the men's rankings over the last few years. You mentioned the 2015 game. We have this great clip when the winning women's national team was invited to the White House to meet then President Barack Obama.
This team taught all America's children that playing like a girl means you're a badass.
I play that clip because, it's great to see when athletes are recognized for their hard work. But I'm wondering, too, at that moment, and also going further back to the 1999 team, how the performance, the achievements by these women athletes, how that has propelled and made soccer even more popular. Alicia, are we seeing that? Have we seen that since 1999?
Yeah, I think definitely the 99ers sparked that throughout the country and throughout the world. But what they were hoping would be a revolution in terms of equality and treatment and pay kind of fell off a little bit after that. So that's what the big point that this team and what they're calling themselves the 19ers are trying to make sure doesn't happen after this World Cup is that the conversation continues, and what everybody hoped would happen after the 99 World Cup does happen now.
Molly, what are your memories of that game?
99?
Yeah, 99.
You know,
that whole
it's really
season.
funny. That actually happened on my 25th birthday, so that's a long time ago now. I'm thinking of that just in terms of what was going on in the United States at that time. You just had a wildly successful 1996 Olympics in Atlanta where the U.S. women just owned everything. Soccer, softball, basketball, the first beach volleyball competition. I mean, the gymnastics team. The U.S. women just owned that Olympics. And out of that came the WNBA, which was 1997, 98. And then you've got the 99ers. And it wasn't just in sports. This wasn't just happening in a vacuum. You've got Lilith Fair going on and Sheryl Crow and Sarah McLachlan on the cover. I know, right? 25, like I said. So there was just really something going on. But Alicia mentions it was kind of the revolution that didn't happen. And the things that didn't happen were completely out of the women's control. It was literally 2 years later that we've got a terrorist attack and we go to war, and that patriotism is wrapped up in so much toxic masculinity. And following that is an economic collapse where the investment dollars that had gone into all these different women's sports entities and other women-led entities was pulled. That investment was pulled. It's nice to see. I'm not. I say it's nice to see. That sounds trite, but it's amazing to see what is going on right now. But everybody who was around for 99, it's almost like walking on eggshells. What exactly is going to happen next? If there is another economic downturn, can these leagues or entities sustain? Who is putting in that investment, and will it be a steady source? So it can't just be caught up in the fervor of the moment. It has to be something long term.
My in-studio guest is Molly Yanity, assistant professor of journalism at Quinnipiac. She's a former sports reporter, actually wrote for newspapers for 15 years. She's joining us today here on Where We Live as we talk about women's professional sports. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I want to thank our guest joining us via Zoom, Alicia Delgado, editor and co-founder of Pro Soccer USA. She's been covering the Women's World Cup in France. Also, I understand you're a New England native. So, Alicia, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to look more broadly, again, in women's sports. And we want to hear from you. You can join our conversation. Here's the number, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Are you watching the Women's World Cup? The U.S. women's national team made it to the quarterfinals after beating Spain on Monday. And this Friday, the women will play France. Now, this may surprise some of you. We just talked about it. U.S. women's soccer games have generated more revenue than U.S. men's games over the past 3 years. Again, that's according to the Wall Street Journal. In 2016, women's games garnered or generated $2 million more in revenue than men's games. They're the best in the world, so why are they paid less than their male counterparts? And when you look at women's professional sports broadly, why are they often seen as second tier to men? You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My in-studio guest is Molly Yanity, assistant professor of journalism at Quinnipiac, a former sports reporter. So let's talk about all the money and coverage poured into sports. The scales still tip dramatically towards men's leagues and teams.
Yes, you are correct. But it's very much a microcosm of where we are in society. So if we didn't see that, I think that would be more surprising.
When we look at women's sports, I mean, what sports really rise to the top these days? And then when we look at coverage, is the coverage still dropping?
Sure. Tennis has been the most progressive in terms of pay equality. The U.S. Open was the first Grand Slam to actually have pay equality for the champion, and that actually was in 1973. Thank you, Billie Jean King. The Australian Open in the late 80s actually paid more to the female champions than the men. It ended up slipping the other direction a little bit, but they made a concerted effort for 2001 beyond that it was going to be equal. The French and Wimbledon held out into 2006 and 7. We could have a long discussion about the 3 sets versus 5 sets. Interestingly enough, the reason women play 3 sets actually has more to do with the corsets in the 1800s than it does of anything about equality. But then you could turn around and you look at something like the WNBA, where the median salary is $72,000. The starting pay in the WNBA is $50,000. The Euro League, the women's basketball league in Europe, actually the starting salary is $100,000 there. Interesting. And then you turn around and you look at the NBA median, and it's $582,000. So a giant discrepancy there, and it's really funny because the first thing that I see and hear when I throw that number out, it's like, well, obviously, the NBA is wildly popular. It's also significantly older. It gets tons more coverage, and it's a different game. But the WNBA Players Union right now is in negotiations with the NBA, which is sort of the overseer, if you will. The league is not asking for $572,000 a year for its players. It's simply asking for a bigger percentage of the profit pot that is there right now. It's less than 50%. So of all the expenses, you take out the expenses, you take out what the owners of the teams are going to get. They want more of that money. They're not asking for NBA money. They're not pretending that it's the same thing. They're not pretending that they're on every single night. It's just literally about the percentage of that pie. And when you break something down that way, that seems very fair to me. And I don't understand why that's much of an argument. They're the ones with the leverage. They're the ones playing the game. So that's where we are. That's the same thing with golf. I mean, you look at we just had the PGA Championship. The purse is $11 million. The LPGA Championship just wrapped up. Young Australian named Hannah Green won it. The purse for that was not even $4 million. Okay, so we're talking about, and it's literally, again, they want more of the pie. They're not asking for the same. They just want more of the pie. So we can look at these numbers. We can look at the differences of the competition. But there is a chicken and egg issue about the coverage and the airtime. This is right when we get into my wheelhouse, too. Mm-hmm. So
I should mention that you also cover the Connecticut Sun for The Athletic.
Yes. So when you're like, are you watching the Women's World Cup? I'm like, are you watching the 9-2 Connecticut Sun? I mean, they are on fire right now. I am not their PR person. I am the journalist, though. It's just fun to watch. Okay, so let's talk about that coverage. Beginning in the mid-'90s, a couple scholars from USC, they're now USC and Purdue, began doing a longitudinal study that has come up every few years about the percentage of airtime on highlight shows on SportsCenter and in the main networks in Los Angeles, and how much of those highlights shows are devoted to women's sports. So when they started this in the mid-'90s, it was about 4%. And we get to 98, right after the Olympics, right when the WNBA is starting and getting rolling, right before the 99 World Cup, we hit a peak. And those were about almost 10% in those highlight shows. Right now, we're back down to lower than where we started. We're about 3%. Now, I can't definitively say, well, that means that there's only 3% of all coverage is devoted to women. That's literally from the highlight shows. It's a good measure. But so does more coverage mean more eyeballs, more rear ends and seats? Does it mean more sponsorship? Looking at what we just talked about from 1998 and the things that were going on then, at that point, yeah, it did. So the coverage was kind of just all working together in a cycle. So we've come back down, and again, this was the coming back down was partly due to a couple wars, an economic downturn, but we're seeing more investment, and we're not seeing the coverage follow that. Something that I think that is really positive, though, is that if I want to watch women's sports, I have more outlets to do so. I can stream any number of women's college athletics games. Example, just this spring, I got to see Providence College's softball team play. We have a really successful rugby team at Quinnipiac. I can go to QuinnipiacBobcats.com and watch that. I can watch regular season or preseason basketball games anytime. I can go to the computer and watch that. But it's not going to be in prime time. It's not going to be easily accessible, but they are there. And I think as we're starting to see some of those streaming numbers come up, we're starting to see a little bit more on the ESPNs and ABCs and NBCs. But it's going to be that chicken and egg thing. I mean, the coverage will help with investment, but the investment will help with the coverage.
And getting some really talented people to play.
Absolutely. We haven't had zero shortage of very talented people to play, especially in this country for a long time. And I don't mean that to sound, only the United States has great female athletes, but the investment in women's sports in the U.S., despite its shortcomings, it is still pretty darn good compared to the rest of the world.
But you mentioned for women's basketball, if they play abroad, they're making more money than they
and that's why
here.
Most of them do. Most of them do. We have just this off season. The WNBA season is about 5 months, a little bit longer if you get deep into the playoffs. So we're talking about let's say I'm making $75,000 a year. Good living. No one's going to complain about that. But then I can more than double that if I just go play in Europe for one of these seasons. So I've doubled that. And when you really think about it, athletes, their employment window is really short. So they have to maximize this. So then just this offseason, we've seen some really serious injuries that are happening overseas, and there's just no break for the women. I mean, they aren't letting their bodies heal. The most notable of those injuries is the returning MVP Breanna Stewart, who was obviously a big star at UConn. She led the Seattle Storm to the championship last fall, and she tore her Achilles in the EuroLeague playoffs. So she's out for this season. And, that just on the surface, that looks like it's going to hurt the WNBA in viewership. It actually hasn't. The WNBA has actually increased its viewership this season so far, even without its big stars not playing, because you also have a few more UConn players to drop here. Sue Bird, Diana Taurasi, both injured. So the faces that we're used to seeing aren't on the screens, but the games are still drawing really well right now.
Molly Yannity is my in-studio guest here on Where We Live, assistant professor of journalism at Quinnipiac, a former sports reporter. She also covers the Connecticut Sun currently for The Athletic as we talk about women's professional sports and also the future of these sports. Before we talk about that, can we go a little further back into history, Molly, when we look at when women's access to sports really changed, and that was with Title IX. Can we talk a little bit about that? What we saw.
1972. At the time, I'm throwing around a lot of numbers. So at the time in 1972, only 1 in 27 girls under 18 played sports. In 40 years, that number had more than jumped 600% to 40%. And we're a little bit over that right now. Number of girls playing high school athletics is more than 3 million. And then we see, obviously, going from high school to college, we see opportunities shrink, but because obviously we're getting into higher levels. But there are more than 200,000 young women playing in college sports, and that's an amazing number. But here's something else: there are actually 50,000 more opportunities for college men to play competitive sports. And that's that's even after this nearly 50 years of progress. So we look at coaching. When Title IX was passed, there was zero money in women's college sports, so women held all the coaching jobs in women's sports. That's not the case anymore. Gino Auriemma here at UConn is, or at least the last time I looked, was the highest paid state employee. That might be Coach Hurley now, but he was and deserves it. But now that there's all this money in the top ends of it, we're seeing there are actually more than 50% male coaches coaching women's teams. So that's where there's still a fight.
When we think about the big money that's being made and earned by whether they're coaches or when we think about the kind of awareness that a school like UConn gets when they've got championship teams, that money's not trickling down to the athletes.
That's not why you had me here to discuss. That's a discussion for another day, because that is that's an important discussion. I mean, we're seeing right now. I mean, California is trying to pass a bill that the college athletes would get some kind of stipend or more money. And the head of the NCAA, the president of the NCAA, who I might add makes more than $5 million a year, overseeing the NCAA, has sent out letters to all the universities in California saying that if this bill passes, that the California teams won't be eligible to compete in the championships. So I'm gonna step away from that one for the time being.
When we think about the number again of girls and women that are playing sports, because by the time college rolls around and depending on where they go, oftentimes there aren't a lot of pathways for women to continue to be professionals.
For sure, there are just not as if we see going from 3.2 million high school to 200,000. College, I mean, it's even, we're talking, maybe 10,000 spots. And that's just a number I'm throwing out. I can't even imagine there are that many. And that's with any, the higher level you get, the fewer spots there are going to be. But really interestingly, we saw, Megan Rapinoe at the beginning of the World Cup having a conversation in a press conference setting, kind of letting the press have it about, the sort of like, oh, the little girls are watching you kind of thing. And, little girls looking up to you. And she kind of went off about the idea that, there are, 15 spots on the U.S. Women's World Cup, on the U.S. Women's National Team. She's like, chances are your kid's never going to get there. And maybe that should not be parents' goals. Maybe you let kids have a good time, and so that there. She was very eloquent in the way I'm not being right now, but it was just here's this whole thing. But then a couple days later, Nike comes up with this commercial that I am going to admit I got goosebumps. Where the players are holding the little girl's hands and running around the pitch, and I'm like, so on one hand, Rapinoe's over here saying your kid's not going to get here, but boy, Nike's sure going to sell you that idea. Right. I mean, so we've got this sort of the capitalistic nature of using these players for that. And, and Rapinoe's a Nike person. She knows this. But so we've got these conflicting messages, which, as the critical sports fan, I'm left just going,
Because you cover the Connecticut Sun, when the games are going on, are the stands full? Are people excited to watch the WNBA here in Connecticut? And does the popularity of UConn's women help propel that excitement?
The Connecticut Sun was the first non-NBA affiliated team in the WNBA. So, I want to say 2002. I might be off on that, but I believe 2002, the Sun they're owned by the Mohegan Tribe and operated by it. But at the time, all of the other teams were affiliates of an NBA team. So they were kind of this great experiment. They play in Mohegan Sun Arena, in a casino, basically. And they were successful right out of the gate. With some pretty, some pretty big personalities, like a Katie Douglas from Purdue. But yes, the UConn, when they play teams that have a lot of UConn players, like a Seattle Storm with Sue Bird and Brianna Stewart, there is a notable difference. They draw about 6,000 a game, which is pretty good. So like the lower bowl is completely filled, and it's a good, quaint environment. It's not going to be 20,000 of the NBA, but no one's expecting that. That's not the expectation. When the Washington WNBA team first started, they were drawing 15,000 a game, and then they weren't successful, and that just plummeted. They now are successful again. They have a superstar in Elena Deladon, who went to Delaware. Here's this just beautiful, amazing basketball player, and people go see her. But then the team kind of flubbed it. They were playing at George Washington University, and then that the arena was being used for something during the NBA Finals, and so they had to play the finals at George Mason, which felt like a million miles away. So the owner finally, they just built a new arena just for them, and it's really small. So it's packed. But I mean, it seats, 7,000 people, but it's absolutely packed, and they have demand to get tickets now. And that's, that's kind of like the club with the line outside, right? People want to get in.
Or before we head to break, just going back to UConn's women, this state is, I guess, unusual when we think about March Madness and the popularity of UConn women when you compare them to other teams. Are there lessons that we can learn to help, catapult some of the popularity for these other women athletes?
That's a hard one because UConn's success is just unprecedented. And yeah, I guess you could say, sure, go out and win 100 championships and the people will follow. It's an absolutely rare and beautiful thing that has gone on at UConn with women's basketball. But the field hockey team's really good. Quinnipiac women's basketball has been in the tournament the last 4 years, made it to the Sweet 16 2 years ago. And that success, we've seen the crowds come up. I also think Quinnipiac and Yale women's hockey, they're very successful, but the crowd's not there at all. So we're kind of back to that promotion and coverage thing. If you're winning, people are going to promote and cover you, right? So I think the lesson is win and people are going to come. But that shouldn't be an expectation because literally half of the teams have to have a losing record, right? So, but I think that when you have a culture and an expectation to win, some pretty remarkable things happen and people respond.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Molly Yannity, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Quinnipiac, a former sports reporter. Speaking of hockey, we're going to talk about that right after the break. We're going to hear from a Connecticut native. She still lives here. She's a member of the U.S. National Women's Ice Hockey Team, but Melissa Samaskevich has joined 200 other players who are sitting out from playing in the professional league this year. We're going to hear why after the break, and you can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about women's professional sports with my guest, Molly Yannity, Professor of Sports Journalism at Quinnipiac University. Now, according to USA Hockey, girls hockey is among the fastest growing youth sports in the country, and there have been nearly 80,000 female players over the last decade. Melissa Samaskevich is one of them. Melissa started playing on a boys hockey team before her passion led her to play high school hockey at a Minnesota prep school. Today, she's a member of the U.S. Women's National Hockey Team, and the Connecticut native and former captain of the Quinnipiac Bobcat women's hockey team joins us now by phone. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I understand that you and your team won gold this spring at the International Ice Hockey Federation Women's World Championship. First, congratulations. What was it like to represent the U.S.?
Thank you. Yeah, it was an unbelievable experience. I've been on national teams before, U18, U22, so you kind of get prepped for that throughout the system and whatnot. But this was definitely like the highlight of my career. It was so awesome to represent my country and just to be with all of those veteran players that I've looked up to for so many years. It was definitely unforgettable for sure.
Who are some of the players that have been your mentors?
Casey Bellamy, Brianna Decker, Amanda Kessel, Hillary Knight, Ken McCoy. There's so many I could go on.
So you say you've been playing with the national team for a few years since high school. That might be surprising for some people to hear. So how do you get to be that level?
Yeah, so it's a process. So you go through several camps. So there's one out of Connecticut, there's one out, and then you move on to one in New England, and then from there you move on to one that's a national camp for all of the girls all over the country, and then from there you get invited to the U18 invite camp. So it's a lot of camps, it's a lot of hard work, but it's totally worth it.
Mm-hmm. So you graduated from Quinnipiac this past spring. You're on the U.S. National team for ice hockey. So have you always been interested in playing professionally?
Yes, I mean, it was always a dream, but like growing up, we didn't really have the dream. We had the CWHL later on as I grew up. I wasn't, but I didn't really know much about it just because it wasn't like a huge sustainable league. So yeah, I mean now I do, and now I'm looking for professionally one day. But yeah, we want to push that for younger girls growing up.
You mentioned the CHL. You're talking about the Canadian Hockey League for women, which just folded. In 2015, there was a National Women's Hockey League formed here in the United States. You were drafted to play for the Connecticut Whale, but you're taking a gap year. Tell us why you've joined other professional women players in taking time off.
Yeah, we want our Players Association is about 200 plus of us that decided to take this gap year. And what we're looking for is a sustainable league, and that means like just with resources. Like we need the clear tape, the training, the medical staff, just like from our team. But that goes along with that is a salary too, a salary where we don't need another job. And hopefully one day we can get that, and that would make it awesome for younger girls, like I said, to grow up with a league like that and to have a dream to play in it one day.
When you mentioned that the salary, you want a better salary so that you can play, and also that girls can dream that they can be part of a professional league one day without holding multiple jobs. What is the current salary for a professional player today?
It's not very much. I'm a rookie going in, so I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's around less than $10,000 a year.
So $2,000 to $10,000 a year. That's mind-boggling when you think about how much is spent on marketing certain professional sports teams. When people hear that, I'm sure they're probably pretty surprised.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of crazy. I mean, a lot of my teammates need other jobs and whatnot to support themselves.
Is everyone in the women's ice hockey community in agreement to take this gap year? I mean, how do you deal with conversations maybe with teammates on the national team who may be opposed to that idea?
Yeah, so most of all of the national team girls are on board, but of course there's going to be people who think otherwise, and that's great. I mean, especially since it's such a big topic, you kind of need the controversy to get through and make it such a big moment, whichever way our leagues and our game ends up going. And people have signed for the NWHL, and that's great for them. If that's what they believe, then awesome. But as a squad, we don't really think that, and that's just kind of going to go, I guess. But hopefully one day we're all on the same page.
I understand back in 2017, the national women's ice hockey team threatened a boycott for living wage, and they got the living wage. So do you look at that as a model?
Yes, definitely. So I'm very lucky to come into this professional league out of college and have such great veterans that have been through the league and understand what we want and what we need. They're so knowledgeable. So I've been listening a lot to them, and when that happened in 2017, all the younger girls were notified, even if we weren't on the team, just to kind of put the message in our head and kind of to tell us what was going on, and that was awesome. But yeah, I mean, that part is a huge part for us as well, and that's another step for our game.
As I mentioned, there is a National Women's Hockey League. This is the gap year that you're taking and not playing with one of the team, the Connecticut Whale. Is it your hope that maybe the NHL will back up professional women's ice hockey players and have something similar to what the WNBA is? Yeah,
I mean, that would be sweet. That would be awesome. I'm sure we would be very successful if that happened, but that's two-sided. So they would need to want to do that too, and maybe one day they would. That would be unbelievable. But for now, we just are kind of looking for sponsors, looking for support from other associations and whatnot. And until then, we're just going to keep battling it out.
And then what's in your future as you sit out again for this gap year and not play for the National Women's Hockey League? Are you be playing internationally?
I might be. I'm kind of to be determined on that right now. But it would be an awesome experience to go overseas and play. But yeah, like I said, right now I'm to be determined. Hopefully soon I find out.
Well, Melissa Samoskevich, again, is a Connecticut resident, a member of the U.S. Women's National Ice Hockey Team, and a former Quinnipiac Bobcat. She joined us today to talk a little bit about what led her to hockey and also what her hopes are for playing the game in the future. Melissa, thanks so much for joining us here on Where We Live.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I want to turn back to my in-studio guest, Molly Yanity, professor of sports journalism at Quinnipiac University. Molly, what's your response when you hear Melissa talk about how she and almost 200 other professional ice hockey players, women players, are sitting out because they want to see a sustainable league?
My first response is, yeah, that's a Quinnipiac student. Well-spoken, thinking of the future. I'm really proud of her. She is something to watch play, too. A couple different thoughts beyond that. First, when in this conversation you had with her, the first thing she starts talking about is, to get to this level, she attended all these different camps. And that takes investment. That took investment from USA Hockey. So, put a check in the plus side here. The next part is the NHL has had its collective bargaining issues with its own players over the last decade. I'm hard pressed to be optimistic about the idea that the NHL does get on board with this. But I think it would be solid. I mean, the numbers that you presented at the beginning of your conversation with her, of the fastest growing women's or girls sport, along with rugby, I believe that is. That's exciting, and there are people. I'm going to be completely honest. After living on the West Coast for most of my adult life, I was not much of a hockey fan, and honestly, I just didn't know a lot about it. I got to Quinnipiac in 2013, and there are no two ways about it. You like hockey or you get out of here. So, I mean, and the thing that drew me was the women's team. I mean, the men's team at Quinnipiac is wildly successful. They are fun to watch, but man, this women's team they're flying around. They're exciting to watch. In this core group of players, several of them played in the NWHL and the Canadian League that just folded. So because they went to these places, I started following them. It's, Melissa mentioned, that she wants to leave something behind. They're doing this for the girls. I think she'd said something like along that line. And, imagine coming out of college and saying, I'm going to put this on hold, my dream here, I'm putting this on hold because I have something that is bigger to take care of. That takes a lot of strength and commitment. So I commend her and the players in the union. She mentioned that this brings about controversy. That controversy brings about a conversation, and that needs to be happening right now. So I genuinely wish him the best. My outlook right now is probably not great, thinking of the investment cycles and what will happen. But the product is there. The players and the product are there.
I want to thank Molly Yanity for joining us. Again, she's a professor of sports journalism at Quinnipiac, also a former sports reporter, and she covers the Connecticut Sun for The Athletic. Molly, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Today's
show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to our technical producer, Kion Wolf. You can learn more about the show at WNPR.org/wherewelive. You can also download our podcast. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.